In 2025, the unthinkable has happened. Canada, America's closest ally, is threatening to cut off the energy lifeline that powers U.S. homes and industries. This unprecedented move has sent shockwaves through both nations, as the intricate web of energy trade that has been built over decades is now at risk of unraveling. The implications are vast, affecting not just the economy, but the very fabric of daily life for millions. What started as a trade spat over new U.S. tariffs has escalated into a crisis, with Canada wielding its vast oil, gas, and electricity exports as leverage. The tariffs, initially aimed at protecting American industries, have backfired spectacularly, leading to a tit-for-tat escalation that neither side anticipated. The stakes are incredibly high, as both countries depend heavily on this energy exchange. The incoming Trump administration is caught off guard by Canada's fierce response, as the rhetoric on both sides grows more heated. Political leaders are scrambling to find a resolution, but the situation is complicated by national pride and political pressures. The media is ablaze with speculation, and public opinion is sharply divided. For decades, the seamless flow of energy across the border was a given. Now that foundation is shaking. The infrastructure that once symbolized cooperation and mutual benefit is now a potential flashpoint. Experts warn that the longer this standoff continues, the more difficult it will be to repair the damage. Suddenly, millions of Americans face the real possibility of power disruptions, and the world is watching to see if this standoff will spiral into a full-blown economic rupture. The uncertainty is palpable, with businesses and households alike bracing for impact. The ripple effects could be felt globally, affecting markets and international relations. This is no longer just about trade, it's a test of the deep ties and vulnerabilities between two of the world's closest allies. The outcome of this crisis will shape the future of North American relations for years to come, and the world is holding its breath, waiting to see what happens next. The crisis began when President-elect Trump announced a sweeping 25% tariff on all Canadian imports, citing border security and fentanyl concerns. Canada saw this as economic aggression, not legitimate policy, and Prime Minister Trudeau declared that everything is on the table for retaliation. The real threat, Canada's role as America's top foreign energy supplier. Trudeau's government tried to show goodwill with a $1.3 billion border security package, but the gesture failed to ease tensions. The core issue remains the tariffs, which Canadian leaders warn would devastate their economy and force them to strike back, starting with energy. The stage is set for a dangerous escalation, with both sides digging in. Canada's response to the crisis is fractured by deep regional divides, with each province voicing its own priorities and anxieties. From the halls of Parliament in Ottawa to the farthest reaches of the provinces, the country's leaders are struggling to find common ground. The sense of unity that once defined Canada is now being tested as never before, with political and economic pressures pulling the nation in different directions. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, now serving as a caretaker leader, steps up to the podium and calls for national unity. He urges Canadians to stand together in the face of external threats, but his looming departure from office has weakened Ottawa's position. The uncertainty surrounding his leadership leaves many wondering who will steer the country through these turbulent times, and whether his appeals for solidarity can truly resonate across the political spectrum. In Ontario, Premier Doug Ford takes a hard line, threatening to cut electricity exports to U.S. border states. Ford's stance is bold and confrontational, reflecting the anger of many Ontarians who feel targeted by American tariffs. He frames the crisis as a test of Canadian resolve, insisting that Ontario will not be bullied by its southern neighbor. Ford rallies Canadians against Trump's tariffs, urging citizens to stand up for their jobs and their future. His rhetoric is fiery, and he quickly becomes a symbol of resistance, drawing crowds and media attention as he calls for a strong, united front against American economic aggression. Meanwhile, in Alberta, Premier Danielle Smith charts a different course. She refuses to halt oil exports, arguing that diplomacy and negotiation are the only way forward. Smith warns that weaponizing Canada's energy resources could have devastating consequences, not just for Alberta, but for the entire country. She cautions that using energy as a weapon could tear Canada apart, deepening the rifts between provinces and undermining the Federation itself. Smith's approach is measured, but it puts her at odds with more aggressive voices in Ottawa and other provinces. Smith's direct talks with Donald Trump highlight a growing rift. Alberta won't back Ottawa's threats unless the federal government backs down from its hardline stance. The province's willingness to negotiate independently signals a new era of provincial assertiveness, challenging the traditional balance of power within Canada. In Quebec, Premier François Legault warns of the economic fallout that could hit both sides of the border. He stresses the importance of protecting Quebec's industries and jobs, and calls for a pragmatic approach that avoids escalation. Legault's message is clear: economic stability must come before political posturing. In Newfoundland and Labrador, the Premier likens energy to Canada's queen in a high-stakes chess match. He argues that energy resources are the country's greatest asset, but also its greatest vulnerability, and urges caution in how they are used on the international stage. These conflicting provincial stances make a unified Canadian strategy nearly impossible. Each leader is pulling in a different direction, reflecting the unique pressures and interests of their own regions. The result is a patchwork of policies and priorities with no clear path forward. The crisis exposes not just a Canada-US divide but a Canadian one as well. The fractures between provinces are laid bare, raising questions about the country's ability to act as a single united nation in times of crisis. The question now looms larger than ever: can Canada act as one, or will its internal fractures undermine its leverage on the world stage? The answer may determine not just the outcome of this crisis, but the future of the Canadian Federation itself. America's energy dependence on Canada is massive and immediate. Few realize just how deeply the US relies on its northern neighbor to keep the lights on, cars moving, and industries running. This relationship is not just about convenience, it's about necessity, woven into the very fabric of North American life. In 2025, Canada supplies 60% of US oil imports, millions of barrels every single day. Many Midwest refineries are designed specifically to process Canadian crude, making this supply chain almost irreplaceable in the short term. Without Canadian oil, these refineries would struggle to operate, and the US would be forced to scramble for alternative sources, likely at much higher costs. A sudden cutoff would cripple these refineries, causing fuel shortages, long lines at gas stations, and dramatic price spikes across the country. Everyday life would be disrupted, from commuting to work to shipping goods across states. But oil is just the beginning. Canada also provides 93% of US electricity imports, a lifeline for border states that depend on this steady flow to power homes and businesses. Nearly all imported natural gas also comes from Canada, fueling everything from heating systems to power plants. Even uranium, the critical fuel for US nuclear power plants, is sourced largely from Canadian mines. This means that Canada's resources are essential not just for today's energy needs, but for America's long-term energy security. The two nations' energy systems are deeply intertwined, once a symbol of partnership, now a source of vulnerability. Decades of cooperation have built a network that is efficient, but also exposes both countries to risk if the flow is disrupted. Disrupting this flow would be a logistical nightmare for the US, threatening everything from transportation to manufacturing. For Canada, it would mean losing its largest energy customer overnight, a self-inflicted wound with severe economic consequences. The stakes are enormous: economic pain on both sides of the border with no easy fixes in sight. The US-Canada energy partnership is a double-edged sword, vital but fragile and more important than ever in a world of shifting global alliances. A trade war would hit both countries hard. For Americans, tariffs mean higher prices on everything from cars to soda cans, as supply chains cross the border multiple times. An energy cutoff would trigger blackouts in border states and send fuel prices soaring nationwide. But Canada is even more exposed. Its economy relies on US exports, and tariffs could push it into recession. Cutting off oil would devastate Canada's own energy sector, sacrificing its biggest export market. Both sides face a lose-lose scenario, crippling each other and themselves. The integrated North American economy, built over decades, is suddenly at risk. Ordinary people on both sides would pay the price. Despite the threats, most experts doubt Canada will actually cut off energy. The reason: mutually assured economic destruction. Alberta, the oil heartland, opposes an embargo, and without its cooperation, Ottawa's threat is hollow. Shutting off oil would devastate Canada's economy and trigger a national unity crisis. Meanwhile, the US can partially buffer the shock with its own oil production, though not without turmoil. The energy threat is a bargaining chip, not a real plan, meant to force talks, not trigger collapse. Most analysts expect a negotiated settlement, but warn that miscalculation could still spark disaster. The risk brinkmanship turning into a crisis neither side wants. The Canada-US standoff would send shockwaves through global energy markets. With non-OPEC supply peaking, the world is more reliant on Middle Eastern oil than ever. A sudden US scramble for oil would drive up global prices, sparking bidding wars and shifting geopolitical power back to OPEC. Canada's new Trans Mountain pipeline gives it access to Asian markets, slightly reducing its dependence on the US, and making its threats more credible. Other energy producers like Russia could seize the moment to expand their influence. For energy-hungry nations, Canadian oil becomes a coveted alternative. The lessened energy disputes in North America can reshape markets and alliances worldwide. The future of the Canada-US relationship hangs in the balance. Trump's first moves as president will determine if this crisis escalates or cools down. Canada's next leader faces the challenge of uniting divided provinces and forging a coherent strategy. Economic indicators and market reactions will pressure both sides to find a solution before real damage sets in. Industry leaders are already urging restraint, warning that decades of prosperity are at risk. This is about more than tariffs or oil. It's about the fate of one of the world's closest partnerships. What happens next will shape North America's future and offer a lesson to the world about the dangers of weaponizing trade and energy.